So I personally had a hard time finding non-vascular seedless plants in my area. I looked around for like hours, but here's an example of something that I was looking for, which is moss. As you can see, like a lot of non-vascular seedless plants, they grow very close to the ground because without a vascular system, it really prevents high growth because the ability to disperse nutrients is limited. I also had a hard time finding vascular plants with no seeds in the area, but here's an example of something that I was trying to look for. These are ferns, and again, they have a vascular system, so that means they're able to better disperse nutrients, but they have no seeds. They use spores instead. I remember in my old high school, which is pretty close to where I live, had pine cones a lot in the area, which is indication of coniferous trees, as you can see right here. And they're gymnosperms and they have exposed seeds. So these are examples of cones that are released from the coniferous tree that I just showed you. As you can see, the bottom left-hand corner, that's the female cone, and it's much larger than that of the male cone, which is this much smaller one. This larger cone consists of a central axis, and it also has a cluster of scales called strobili, and those are the exposed seeds. Something really interesting about these cones, I used to collect these in high school, and the reason I really like them is because they have this really cool spiral, and the spiral is in coordination with something called the Fibonacci sequence, which is basically what the sequence of adding two numbers before it making the next number. So 1 plus 1 is 2, 2 plus 1 is 3, 3 plus 2 is 5, and so on and so forth. And that's the organization of this spiral. And I always think that's really cool when math and biology coincide. So that's just a little fun fact for you. Now this smaller, oh my gosh, it already fell apart in my hand. But that just goes to show you, this is the smaller pollen-based male cone. And as you can see, it's meant to fall apart really easily as to disperse the pollen. So this is one of the flowering species in my area. I thought it was really interesting because of its shape. It kind of looks like a swan, and the petals are more sprayed out in a fan-like fashion. It's pretty clear that it's a flowering species just based on the petals. And I think this bottom part right here is a perching area for birds. We do have a lot of birds in the area, so I figure that the pollinator for this species is a bird, and they use that perch in order to get access to nectar. I'm a little bit more confused about how this may be structured just because it's so different, but I kind of looked it up beforehand, and apparently this blue section is like the female part of the flower, and even looking at it, you can sort of see, it's kind of hard to see on camera, but you can see some of the sticky nectar coming out of the middle section over here. So this is a really interesting species that I thought I'd look at. I use these flowers to observe pollination because of their two-wheeler shape, their color, the fact that they're small, and they have a nice scent. I suspected that bees were likely the pollinators. I was partially incorrect, it was wasps, but that makes sense since they're closely related to bees, and I observed about 2 instances of pollination. Since I was unable to find some of the species or plants in the other plant groups, I thought I would share some of the plants that I did see during my exploration. This is an example of a fortnight lily. As you can see, it has 3 uniform dots on its petals, and it's called the fortnight lily because it tends to bloom in 2-week intervals. I just thought this was such an interesting looking plant. Its unofficial name is the dagger plant. It has an official name, but it's a bit difficult for me to pronounce. Surprisingly, this is a flowering species, and these species tend to grow in dry areas and in sandy dunes, and they grow pretty tall, as you can see. So I went to this abandoned lot near my place to look at some of the plants that were growing there, and a lot of them were weeds, which makes sense because they tend to be more invasive. This is a horseweed. The reason it's called a horseweed, by the way, is because there's little hairs, if you look really closely at some of these blades, that creates a shadow that looks like a horsetail, hence the name horseweed. And again, this is also a vascular seeding plant.